Evelyn Carter sat hunched over her workstation, surrounded by the soft hum of machines and the endless cascade of cosmic data flowing across her screens. She was used to noise. The universe was full of it, the constant background hum of the cosmic microwave radiation, the flickering signals of distant pulsars, the static hiss of solar winds brushing against the Earth's magnetic shield. But this was different. She first noticed it during a late-night session when she was running a deep filter analysis on archived signals from a satellite array orbiting far beyond the cluttered atmosphere of Earth. At first, she dismissed it, a flicker, a pulse, an irregular beat in an otherwise predictable flow. She told herself it was a software glitch, maybe a calibration error. The systems were aging after all, and anomalies happened. Evelyn was meticulous by nature, not easily swayed by excitement or paranoia. She logged the anomaly, noted the time, and moved on. But when it appeared again, and then again incompletely, separate datasets drawn from different instruments located thousands of miles apart, her curiosity sharpened. She reran the diagnostics, rechecked the calibration protocols, and recalibrated the sensors manually. Everything checked out clean, yet the anomaly persisted, threading itself through unrelated data streams. Like a whisper trying to be heard, she expanded her search, pulling in raw signal outputs from space telescopes across multiple observatories, even tapping into deep space listening posts. Maintained by private research foundations, patterns emerged, subtle but undeniable. Not a repetition in frequency, but a repetition in structure, a hidden architecture weaving through the noise. Evelyn stayed up for days, mapping the occurrences, by hand, plotting the points against cosmic events, searching for any correlation. Solar flares, asteroid movements, gravitational waves. Nothing lined up. It was as if the signal existed beneath the surface of all known phenomena, not caused by them, not responding to them, but threading through them like an unseen skeleton holding up the skin of the universe. She brought her findings to her peers quietly, cautiously, but found only skepticism at best and outright dismissal. At worst, background radiation anomalies were nothing new, they said, and Evelyn's suggestion that there might be an underlying pattern was met with polite nods and rapid changes of subject. The scientific community had grown wary of anything that smacked of hidden messages in the stars. Evelyn knew the caution was justified. There had been too many false alarms over the decades. Yet her instincts screamed at her that this was different. She could feel it humming at the edges of her mind like a song she could almost but not quite hear. Determined not to be brushed aside, she decided to approach someone outside the traditional academic circles, someone who might understand the language of signals at a deeper level. She called Daniel Voss, a quantum communication specialist she had worked with years ago, known for his brilliance and his willingness to consider the impossible. When Evelyn presented the raw data, Daniel listened without interruption, his sharp eyes scanning the shifting waveforms on the screen. When she finished, he leaned back, arms crossed, and said softly, "This is not noise." Evelyn felt a wave of vindication and fear ripple through her. Daniel pointed out that the anomalies exhibited characteristics of intentional modulation, not the chaotic randomness expected from natural processes. Even quantum noise had statistical boundaries, and these patterns exceeded them subtly but consistently over time. He suggested that what they were seeing was a form of encoding, not in the traditional sense of binary logic, but in layers of phase modulation and frequency resonance, something that spoke in the language of harmonics. Evelyn and Daniel worked together, running deeper analyses. They discovered that the signal operated across multiple bands, simultaneously weaving through low-frequency radio waves, mid-range microwave bands, even faint ripples in gravitational detection arrays. It was everywhere, yet nowhere fully visible, unless you knew precisely how to look, and once you saw it, You could not unsee it. Evelyn began to experience moments where she would catch fragments of the pattern in the natural world. The way leaves rustled against each other, the way waves broke upon the shore, even in the cadence of her own breath. She grew both exhilarated and haunted by the awareness. Daniel was more cautious, reminding her that correlation was not causation, but even he could not deny the feeling that something vast and deliberate was unfolding just beyond the threshold of human perception. Together they decided to expand their team, to bring in minds who could help interpret what they were beginning to call the invisible signal. Evelyn reached out to Jonathan Price, a biologist who had spent his career studying emergent intelligence in ecosystems, and Samuel Reed, a cognitive theorist obsessed with collective memory and shared dreaming. Both men were skeptical at first, but the data spoke for itself. When they applied biofield sensors in controlled environments, they detected faint but reproducible anomalies corresponding to the same structural patterns Evelyn had found in the cosmic data. It was as if the signal was not confined to the void of space, but was infiltrating the very roots of life on Earth. Evelyn documented every step meticulously, her notebooks filled with intricate diagrams, overlapping fields, and resonance charts. She felt herself changing too. Her dreams grew vivid, filled with symbols she could not interpret, feelings she could not describe. There were nights when she woke, gasping, tears streaming down her face, certain that she had touched some deep river of memory that ran through all things. Daniel observed similar changes in himself, though he remained more analytical, probing for mechanical explanations. Jonathan and Samuel reported an increase in synchronicities, moments where thoughts and external events aligned with uncanny precision. None of them spoke openly yet of what they feared, that the signal was not simply being received, but was somehow awakening something latent within them. Evelyn knew that they stood on the brink of a discovery that could shatter the foundations of human understanding or be swallowed by fear and forgotten. She resolved that no matter what resistance they faced, she would not let this knowledge be buried. She would follow the signal wherever it led, even if it led into the deepest darkness of the unknown. And so she sat again under the shifting skies, her eyes burning from lack of sleep, her heart pounding not with fear but with the unbearable gravity of wonder. She whispered to herself, not yet realizing the full weight of the words, "This is not random, this is not by chance, this is the beginning." After nights of solitary research and silent battles against the tides of doubt, Evelyn Carter knew she needed allies, ones who could see beyond conventional boundaries and help her navigate the widening unknown. She first reached out to Daniel Voss, whose mind had always operated at the edges of what was considered plausible. Daniel specialized in quantum communication, a field where particles separated by light years could whisper to each other without any observable bridge. If anyone could understand the subtlety of the invisible signal, it was him. When Evelyn shared her preliminary data, Daniel did not react with the knee-jerk skepticism she had grown accustomed to. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression sharpening with every shifting waveform he studied. When he finally spoke, it was not to dismiss, but to confirm the magnitude of what she had found. He pointed out phase patterns buried deep within the noise structures that hinted at non-random organization. Daniel brought a critical eye to their early collaboration, setting up algorithms that could sift through the mountains of data Evelyn had accumulated, filtering for the minute phase shifts and harmonic overlays that traditional methods overlooked. His presence stabilized Evelyn's initial excitement, grounding it in a rigorous analytical framework. While she felt the song in her bones, Daniel dissected it with surgical precision, mapping its architecture layer by elusive layer. But they quickly realized that understanding the signal on a technical level was not enough. Its reach extended into biological systems in ways neither of them could fully explain. Evelyn thought immediately of Jonathan Price, an old acquaintance whose work on emergent intelligence in ecosystems had challenged established models of environmental science. Jonathan was a man of deep patience who believed that forests, rivers, and even deserts could think in ways humans had yet to comprehend. When Evelyn and Daniel approached him, Jonathan was wary, not because he doubted them, but because he understood the gravity of what such a discovery might mean. After reviewing their findings, he agreed to join their effort, bringing a crucial new lens through which to view the phenomena. Jonathan began deploying sensitive biofield sensors in isolated ecosystems, places far from human interference, forests that had remained untouched for centuries, deep oceanic vents where life clung to extremes, mountains where the air itself seemed charged with forgotten secrets. His early results were staggering. Plants in certain regions exhibited rapid shifts in growth patterns, forming networks of mutual support beyond any documented form of symbiosis. Fungal colonies and tree roots communicated through chemical signals that seemed to modulate in rhythm with the phases of the invisible signal. Even microbial mats showed an unexpected complexity, behaving less like random populations and more like unified entities. Jonathan documented every anomaly, every spike in coherent behavior, carefully cross-referencing them against the timing and intensity of the detected signal, while Evelyn mapped the sky and Daniel decoded the harmonics. Jonathan mapped the pulse of life itself, finding the fingerprints of the signal in the green breath of the world. Still, something was missing. The signal was not only moving through space and life, it was moving through minds, dreams, visions, sudden bursts of creativity that could not be explained by mere chance. Evelyn thought of Samuel Reed, a cognitive theorist whose controversial studies on the collective unconscious had often placed him at odds with more conservative academics. Samuel believed that human consciousness was not isolated, but interconnected, forming a kind of planetary neural network capable of receiving and transmitting information far beyond the scope of individual awareness. When Evelyn and Daniel presented their case to him, Samuel listened intently without interruption, his pale blue eyes gleaming not with disbelief but with recognition. He told them that he had been seeing patterns too, patterns in the dreams, reported across disparate communities, in the myths resurfacing in isolated tribes, in the sudden, synchronous innovations appearing in art, science, and culture, in places untouched by modern communication. Samuel joined the team without hesitation, bringing with him a method of mapping thought fields, aggregating reports of dreams, symbols, and sudden intuitions from across the globe. He created a dynamic map of human resonance zones, regions where the collective unconscious seemed to pulse in tandem with the invisible signal. What emerged from Samuel's data sent chills through the group. The zones of heightened cognitive activity aligned almost perfectly with Jonathan's biological resonance zones and Daniel's electromagnetic phase anomalies. The Earth was waking up, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, communally. The signal was not merely scientific, it was existential, and it was accelerating. Each member of the team brought their own strengths and biases. Evelyn, the passionate seeker, burning with intuition and relentless curiosity. Daniel, the meticulous architect of patterns, always grounding speculation in proof. Jonathan, the patient observer of living systems, attuned to the rhythms of non-human intelligence. Samuel, the weaver of dreams and minds, seeing the hidden connections between isolated thoughts. They did not always agree. Evelyn saw the signal as a song, a living memory seeking to be heard. Daniel viewed it as a complex transmission, perhaps even an ancient technology. Jonathan perceived it as an ecological catalyst, a spark to accelerate the evolution of entire biospheres. Samuel believed it was a call to consciousness, a summoning to awaken the collective mind of the planet. Arguments sometimes flared as each perspective clashed with the others, but rather than fracture their collaboration, the tensions deepened it. Each disagreement forced them to refine their thinking, sharpen their hypotheses, weave a tapestry that was stronger for the diversity of its threads, and so they worked tirelessly in a remote facility nestled in a mountain valley shielded from the electromagnetic chaos of modern civilization under the strange skies, alive with shifting colors they collected. Data ran experiments, compared notes, and debated. Long into the nights, the signal continued to grow stronger, more insistent in its rhythm, its complexity unfolding like a living organism. The deeper they looked, the more they realized that time was short. The changes in biological systems, the shifts in human consciousness, the increasing coherence of the auroras, all pointed toward a convergence, a moment when the signal would no longer be background noise but foreground reality. Evelyn felt it in her bones like the tightening of a great unseen bowstring. Daniel saw it in the data curves bending ever steeper. Jonathan heard it in the forests, the way the trees whispered differently. Samuel dreamed it every night, the same vision of a door, vast and ancient, swinging slowly open toward a light too bright. To comprehend, they were racing not against each other, but against the inertia of a humanity, too distracted, too divided to see what was unfolding around them, and within them together they stood at the edge of something that had no name, no precedent, no clear outcome, only the certainty that the world they knew was already fading and a new one waited, trembling just beyond the veil. The deeper Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Price, and Samuel Reed pushed into the mystery, the more undeniable chilling truth became the signal was not just out there beyond the stars whispering from the deep void. It was here, it had always been here, embedded like a second pulse within the living skin of the planet. Evelyn first caught the anomaly while running calibration sweeps on atmospheric readings late one night. The signal patterns she had once thought confined to deep space instruments were showing up faintly but persistently in terrestrial datasets. Signals woven into the ionosphere, hidden within. The whispers of the upper winds not transmitted across the vacuum of space, but resonating within the very breath of the Earth itself. Daniel double-checked the findings with a skeptical eye, recalibrating the devices, manually isolating variables, eliminating every possibility of artificial interference. The results were clear. The same harmonic fingerprints buried in cosmic noise were present, right here flowing through the air. They inhaled and exhaled every moment their discovery fractured any lingering assumptions about the nature of the signal. Jonathan quickly redirected his attention to the soil, the rivers, the forests. He embedded microsensors into remote environments, from the heart of ancient woodlands to the shores of glacial lakes. The patterns returned everywhere, slight variances in frequency adapted to the medium, yet unmistakably related. At first, Jonathan thought the signal might be confined to the upper atmosphere, carried perhaps by electromagnetic storms or solar winds, but the ground itself pulsed with its roots, intertwined with the hidden rhythms. Minerals vibrated with faint echoes of the great structure trees, bent imperceptibly toward some silent, unheard chord, as if remembering an ancient music. Samuel, meanwhile, turned inward, gathering reports from isolated communities, individuals who spoke of dreams filled with pulsing lights, of a deep hum thrumming through the bones of mountains and deserts. There were whispered stories of old places, stones that sang when no one else listened, waters that shimmered in impossible ways under starlight. To Samuel, it was more than coincidence. It was memory rising through the flesh of the earth itself, an ancient inheritance straining against the walls of human forgetting. Evelyn spent sleepless nights cross-referencing datasets, mapping locations where the signal appeared strongest. To her astonishment, it did not correlate neatly with human settlements or technological hubs. Instead, it clustered around places of old, untouched by heavy industry, sacred sites, hidden valleys, primeval forests. She realized that the signal was not merely present, it was stronger where the living Earth was more intact, less disrupted by the scars of civilization. Daniel proposed that the signal might be interacting with the natural electromagnetic fields generated by living systems, the heartbeat of the Earth. The Schumann resonances, the subtle electrical murmurs produced by the movement of water through rock, by the photosynthesis of leaves, by the currents coursing through animal bodies. It was not a transmission imposed from outside, but an awakening from within. Evelyn likened it to a great sleeper stirring beneath layers of stone and time, not with violence, but with an inexorable rising awareness. Jonathan observed that ecosystems most in tune with natural cycles responded more dramatically. Fungal networks, tree canopies, coral reefs, all showed emergent behaviors as if an invisible hand had brushed across the web of life and set it vibrating. Samuel warned that such a presence, if misunderstood, could trigger profound psychological disruptions. Humanity was not prepared to confront a reality where the ground itself might think, where the air might sing, with voices too ancient to translate. Still, they pressed forward, layering evidence upon evidence, building a mosaic of revelation. Beneath the polished theories of the modern world was a living current of memory flowing through matter itself. The implications staggered them. Daniel speculated that the signal could represent a form of distributed intelligence, not centered in any one organism, but rising from the sum total of biological and geological systems. Evelyn wondered aloud whether Earth had been seeded long ago by forces that left not only genetic material but resonant instructions coded into the very architecture of matter. Jonathan contemplated whether ecosystems evolved not solely through random mutation and selection, but through resonant guidance shaping life toward patterns that harmonized with a grander design. Samuel mused that myths of speaking rivers, singing mountains, dreaming forests were not poetic flights of fancy, but dim echoes of a truth humanity once knew and had forgotten. Their debates grew fierce, but their unity held. Each brought different fears, different hopes. Evelyn feared that humanity's arrogance would blind it to the gift being offered. Daniel feared that misunderstanding the signals, complexity could lead to catastrophic interference. Jonathan feared that the delicate balance of Earth's systems might be shattered by reckless human attempts to control or exploit the resonance. Samuel feared that the psychological shock of awakening to a sentient Earth could splinter civilizations already teetering on the brink. Yet amid their fears burned a fiercer light, awe, wonder, the unmistakable sense that they were touching something sacred, something infinitely older and wiser than themselves. They devised new experiments pushing further. Jonathan embedded deep sensors into ancient bedrock, capturing seismic pulses that aligned suspiciously well with the broader harmonic web. Daniel refined detection algorithms, filtering out human noise, teasing clearer melodies from the Earth's own song. Samuel expanded his dream research, gathering vast data sets of reported visions, emotions, and psychic phenomena, correlating them against cosmic alignments and terrestrial resonances. Evelyn coordinated it all, weaving their findings into an evolving map of planetary consciousness. Slowly, painfully, they began to glimpse the shape of the signal. Not a static message, but a living field, a resonant matrix in which all life participated unconsciously at first. Now increasingly aware, the Earth was not a passive backdrop to human drama. It was a player, an ancient mind dreaming beneath stone and ocean, now stirring, now remembering. And as they pieced the puzzle together, the signal grew stronger. It was no longer hidden in the noise, no longer content to hum beneath awareness. It rose like a tide, pressing against every boundary. The team felt it in their bones, in their dreams, in the strange synchronicities that wove through their daily lives. Evelyn watched birds flock in impossible patterns, tracing glyphs in the sky. Daniel measured fluctuations in local gravity fields that made no conventional sense. Jonathan listened to forests whose leaves rustled, not with wind but with meaning. Samuel dreamed of hands of light shaping continents, stars weaving songs through rivers of space, and always beneath and within the pulse, the rhythm, the call, the earth was singing, not to be heard, not to be worshipped, but to be remembered, to be known again as kin. The signal was not alien, it was home. It was the ancient heart of the world, speaking at last and waiting breathlessly to see if its children would answer. As Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Price, and Samuel Reed delved deeper into the strange, pervasive signal, they came to a realization that unsettled every assumption they had carried into their work. The signal was not a language in any traditional sense. It was not composed of discrete symbols or logical structures. It did not transmit messages with beginning and end. It did not argue, explain, or narrate. Instead, it wove itself through resonance and memory, operating in a way that defied the neat categories of human communication. Evelyn was the first to articulate the suspicion during a late-night discussion. Where exhaustion made them bold, she spoke, quietly, as if afraid that saying it too loudly would make it more real. It feels more like a song than a sentence. She said, more like a memory than a message. Daniel, who had spent his career unraveling complex information systems, initially resisted the idea, but data was not on his side as he layered waveforms upon waveforms, searching for syntax. He found only harmonic relationships, intricate structures that shifted and adapted like living organisms. He realized reluctantly that he was not dealing with a code to be cracked but a field to be felt. Jonathan found confirmation in the ecosystems he monitored in isolated forests, coral reefs, and desert oases. There was a distinct pattern emerging. Life was not merely reacting to external stimuli. It was changing in ways that suggested the reawakening of ancient internal programs. Plants communicated in ways previously undocumented, not through chemical signals alone, but through synchronized vibrational emissions. Fungi extended networks that resembled neural pathways, exchanging information at speeds inconceivable for their known biology. Animal migrations adjusted, subtly aligning not with seasons, but with resonant zones. Samuel mapped human experiences as reports poured in from remote villages and urban dreamers alike. Dreams filled with pulsing geometries, cascading melodies, ancient landscapes, unknown but familiar feelings of deep belonging and urgent becoming. He saw that the human mind, too, was being tuned to a deeper frequency, unlocking memories that never belonged to individual lives, but to the collective unfolding of life on Earth. It was as if the planet itself had been sleeping under a blanket of forgetting, and now through resonance the blanket was being pulled back. Evelyn obsessed over the mechanics of it all, sketching endless diagrams in her notebooks, strings of resonance diagrams, intersecting waves. She proposed that memory was not stored solely in brains or DNA, but encoded in the resonance patterns of matter itself, that every rock, every drop of water, every blade of grass carried faint imprints of experiences layered over eons. The signal was not teaching Earth anything new. It was awakening what had always been there, waiting hidden within the lattice of existence. Daniel shifted his efforts toward modeling how resonance could influence biological structures, using simulations to show how harmonic fields could subtly alter genetic expressions, trigger dormant biochemical pathways, and orchestrate complex behavior across species without any centralized control. He marveled grimly at the elegance of it. Nature had always been a symphony, but now they could finally hear some of the underlying scores. Jonathan dug into ancient myths and found curious consistencies. Stories from disparate cultures speaking of times when the world itself spoke, when mountains gave counsel, rivers taught wisdom, and animals carried knowledge more profound than mere instinct. He realized that perhaps these myths were not fanciful inventions but fragmentary memories of an earlier resonance age, a time when life vibrated in harmony with a cosmic song now being replayed. Samuel cautioned that not all awakenings were gentle. He gathered accounts of individuals who reacted violently to the resonance, suffering from hallucinations, psychotic breaks, violent surges of primal fear. He theorized that the signal was forcing buried memories to surface, memories of extinction trauma, separation from the greater whole, that humanity had long forgotten. The pain of exile from the web of life was not easily borne. They realized that resonance was not selective. It amplified all that lay dormant: beauty and horror, wisdom and madness. They discussed how the signal seemed to target no specific species or intelligence, but life itself, its architecture woven into the foundation of being, activating processes designed to bring living systems back into attunement with larger cosmic rhythms. Evelyn found herself haunted by a recurring dream, standing in a vast field under a sky filled with shifting geometries, the ground beneath her feet humming with a pulse that echoed the beat of her own heart. When she described it, Daniel and Jonathan and Samuel all nodded, having experienced variations of the same dream. They were not being taught, they were being remembered. Evelyn wrote in her notes that the signal acted like a catalyst, a tuning fork struck across the surface of Earth, resonating into the hidden memory of life itself, stirring ancestral songs coded not in words, but in the living breath of matter. Jonathan began cultivating special gardens in isolated plots, exposed to amplified harmonics derived from the signal. He watched in awe as plants grew not just faster, but differently, weaving themselves into intricate cooperative structure. Species that normally competed shared resources. Fungal networks integrated seamlessly with plant roots in ways unseen in known biology. Animal populations around the gardens exhibited reduced aggression, increased cohesion. It was as if life, once reminded of its ancient harmonies, naturally reoriented toward cooperation and mutual flourishing. Daniel charted the energy flows within these experiments, noting that entropy decreased resilience, increased systems once fragile became robust. The garden seemed to remember a deeper order. Samuel collected dreams and spontaneous visions from those living near the experimental sites. People spoke of feeling connected to the land, hearing music in the wind, sensing the presence of unseen companions within the trees and stones. The activation of biological memory was not just physiological, it was spiritual, existential. Evelyn grew convinced that the signal represented a threshold event, not merely an opportunity for new knowledge, but a challenge to remember who and what Earth really was. She feared, however, that the greater human world was too entangled in its distractions to recognize the invitation in time. Daniel shared her concern, noting the increasing noise from political and technological systems, desperate to drown out anything that could disrupt their brittle control. Jonathan worried that if the activation accelerated without guidance, it could fracture ecosystems already weakened by human interference. Samuel feared the psychological consequences of a mass awakening to a reality far stranger and deeper than most minds could handle, yet none of them wished to stop it. They had seen too much, felt too deeply. They understood that the alternative was stagnation, decay, isolation from the greater chorus of existence that humanity had forgotten, but that life itself still remembered. They stood on a precipice not of extinction but of reunion, the resonance growing stronger each day. Not in words, not in shouts, but in the quiet, undeniable rising of memory, like the tide, like the breath of a giant, like the return of a beloved song that had never truly ended. Evelyn, Daniel, Jonathan, and Samuel knew they had to prepare to guide, to listen to, amplify the harmonies wherever they could, for the signal was not coming to save them. It was coming to remind them, and whether humanity remembered or not, the earth was already beginning to sing again. It was Evelyn Carter who first proposed the idea of constructing a controlled environment, a place where the elusive signal could be amplified, isolated, and observed without the chaotic interference of the outside world. They found an abandoned greenhouse complex deep within a forgotten valley, shielded by mountains and far from urban electromagnetic noise. It was there that they would stage their first deliberate experiment into the interaction between the signal and terrestrial life. Daniel Voss handled the technical architecture, building low-energy resonance amplifiers that would subtly enhance the natural presence of the signal without introducing artificial distortions. Evelyn focused on designing a monitoring system to capture even the faintest biological or environmental shifts. Jonathan Price curated the living subjects, selecting a diverse range of plant species, fungi, microorganisms, and insects sourced from nearby ecosystems, while Samuel Reed set up observational protocols for tracking not only physical changes, but behavioral and cognitive shifts. If they occurred at first, the greenhouse seemed like any other controlled experiment, a sterile environment populated by clusters of vegetation and the silent hum of recording devices. For several days, nothing extraordinary happened. Seedlings pushed through soil, leaves unfurled. Fungi spread mycelial threads, just as they always had. Evelyn found herself battling frustration, wondering if perhaps the influence of the signal required more time or more complexity. Daniel suggested patience, pointing out that in systems biology, meaningful shifts often manifested not as immediate changes, but as slow, emergent properties. Jonathan observed closely, taking baseline readings and noting the early formation of microbial colonies. Samuel, meanwhile, listened carefully to the human element, tracking his own dreams and emotional states, as well as those of the team in case the signal exerted more subtle psychological effects. Then, on the seventh day, Jonathan noticed something strange among a group of sapling species that normally competed aggressively for resources, were displaying cooperative behaviors, roots interlaced in ways that allowed nutrient-sharing fungal networks not only integrated but actively prioritized connections between different plant species rather than monopolizing them. Water uptake patterns shifted, indicating that certain plants were regulating their consumption to stabilize the microenvironment. Evelyn triple-checked the data, assuming an error, but the patterns were clear. The ecosystem was behaving as if some hidden logic was guiding it toward mutual benefit rather than blind competition. Daniel analyzed electromagnetic field recordings and discovered faint but structured harmonic patterns aligning with the behavioral shifts, a kind of resonant scaffolding overlaying the biological processes. Samuel documented dreams from team members that mirrored the shifts in the greenhouse dreams of vast forests, where every leaf, every root, and every creature moved in a kind of symphonic coordination. They began to amplify the signal field, slightly tuning it carefully with Daniel's equipment. The results accelerated dramatically within days. Species that should have been locked in evolutionary arms races established intricate symbioses. Insect populations self-regulated, avoiding boom and bust cycles. Microbial mats organized into layered structures that optimized energy flow, and nutrient recycling fungi became the silent architects, weaving connections not for dominance but for resilience. Evelyn was stunned not just by the speed, but by the intelligence of the changes. No one had programmed these outcomes. There was no central control, no overseeing mind, and yet the system was behaving with what could only be described as collective wisdom. Jonathan marveled at the efficiency of it. Biomass increased exponentially, but without waste or collapse, diversity flourished, instead of narrowing as it often did in intense growth environments. Even traditionally invasive species found roles within the evolving web, balancing rather than overwhelming. Samuel noted a profound emotional effect among the human observers, a growing sense of calm, belonging, and subtle euphoria, as if the resonance within the greenhouse was entraining not only biological matter but human consciousness as well. The experiment began to take on the feeling of a living presence, a kind of silent intelligence whispering through the leaves and the soil, guiding each organism to find its place in the whole. Evelyn theorized that what they were witnessing was not evolution in the Darwinian sense of random mutation and selection, but a form of resonant awakening. The signal was not dictating outcomes but unlocking possibilities, buried deep within the genetic and energetic blueprints of life, possibilities designed not for endless competition but for flourishing cooperation. Daniel built models showing how simple resonant feedback loops could drive complex system-wide reorganizations without the need for top-down control, just as schools of fish or flocks of birds moved as one without a leader. So too could ecosystems once attuned to deeper harmonics. Jonathan expanded the experiments, introducing environmental stresses, drought, sudden cold shifts, toxin influxes under normal circumstances. Such disturbances would have led to collapse or chaotic restructuring, but within the greenhouse, the system adapted fluidly, rerouting resources, shifting symbiotic partnerships, maintaining overall stability in ways no conventional ecological model could predict. It was as if the entire ecosystem thought together, feeling and responding as a unified entity. Samuel recorded dreams and waking visions among the team that grew more vivid and interconnected. People dreamt of ancient forests, breathing of rivers that spoke of stars singing in colors unseen during waking life. Even those who remained skeptical could not deny the visceral sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Evelyn cautioned that they were dealing with processes far beyond human comprehension. Tinkering blindly could unleash dynamics they were ill-prepared to manage. Daniel argued that careful mapping and resonance modeling could allow them to navigate the terrain safely. Jonathan emphasized the need for humility, recognizing that they were witnesses, not masters of these forces. Samuel warned that human ego had already severed humanity once from the great song, and that any attempt to dominate or exploit the resonance would only repeat old disasters together. They agreed to proceed slowly, to listen as much as act, to treat the greenhouse not as a machine, but as a sacred space, a microcosm of what Earth itself might become under the full influence of the signal. As the days passed, the greenhouse transformed it, became a shimmering web of life pulsing with invisible music. Flowers bloomed in fractal patterns, insects danced in spirals of astonishing complexity. Mycelial tendrils laced the soil into a living fabric stronger than any man-made weave. Even the air tasted different, fresher, richer, filled with a subtle charge that left skin tingling and hearts strangely light. Evelyn stood one evening in the center of it all, surrounded by the soft hum of countless lives woven into a single tapestry. She realized with a shock of awe that they were not creating something new. They were restoring something ancient, something written into the bones of the world. Long before humanity dreamed of cities and empires, the greenhouse was not an anomaly, it was a memory, a glimpse of what Earth remembered itself to be when it sang in harmony with the cosmos. Daniel monitored the resonance patterns and saw that they were approaching a critical threshold, an inflection point beyond which emergent complexity could surge explosively in unpredictable ways. He advised caution even as he marveled at the beauty unfolding before him. Jonathan documented the interspecies, collaborations mapping networks of cooperation that defied current ecological theory, suggesting that competitive struggle was not the sole driver of evolution, but only one facet of a much larger dance. Samuel listened to the dreams of the team and the surrounding lands, feeling a tide rising, a great remembering stirring through roots and rivers, stones and stars. They had touched something sacred, something vast and alive, and it was awakening all around them, not through conquest, not through control, but through the oldest and simplest truth of all resonance, cooperation, memory, and life. As the greenhouse thrived, Evelyn, Daniel, Jonathan, and Samuel stood at the threshold of a revelation greater than any of them had dared imagine, knowing that the true challenge was not to harness it, but to remember their place within it, and to choose whether to rejoin the ancient song or to turn away and be forgotten. As Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Price, and Samuel Reed expanded their observation network, they realized that the effects of the signal were no longer confined to controlled environments like the greenhouse. The world itself was beginning to stir in ways too dramatic and widespread to ignore. At first, the changes appeared subtle. Almost poetic forests thickened in density with unexpected species weaving new ecological tapestries. Rivers, once slow and meandering, found new, vibrant paths. Waterfalls sprang from places previously barren in remote valleys. Flowers bloomed out of season, shimmering with hues not seen before, as if nature itself were tuning to a higher resonance. Evelyn documented satellite imagery showing the sudden expansion of green belts in areas previously undergoing desertification. In the heart of South America, a withering savanna blossomed into a lush, semi-rainforest within weeks. In Southeast Asia, coral reefs once bleached to bone, white began to thrum with life again. Multicolored fish returning to nurseries thought lost forever. Jonathan, who had long despaired over the degradation of Earth's ecosystems, felt a cautious hope rekindle within him. He traveled to several of these sites, conducting field surveys, collecting soil samples, water readings, and electromagnetic profiles. The data overwhelmed him. Not only was biodiversity surging, but entire ecosystems were reorganizing along lines of cooperation and synergy, rather than competition. Invasive species either adapted harmoniously or were absorbed into new cooperative networks. Daniel measured an uptick in natural electromagnetic fields in these regions, discovering resonant patterns that mirrored those he had seen in the greenhouse. Only here they pulsed with a richness and complexity that suggested a far more ancient and vast intelligence. Samuel, meanwhile, monitored human communities. Living near these awakening landscapes in small villages nestled against reborn forests or vibrant coastlines, people reported vivid dreams, shared visions, and a profound sense of connection to the land. Local healers, shamans, and mystics spoke of the earth singing once again and guiding their communities toward harmony. Evelyn noted that birth rates of endangered species rose inexplicably. Survival rates for seedlings and animal young doubled, even tripled in some regions. It was as if the living Earth, having received the signal, was weaving itself back into a stronger, more coherent form. However, the story was not the same everywhere. In dense urban zones where the natural web had long been severed, a very different kind of reaction was unfolding across major cities. Our unexplained phenomena rattled the established order. Reports emerged of people experiencing heightened emotional states without warning, bursts of euphoria, followed by waves of despair, episodes of intense déjà vu or disorientation, moments where time seemed to stretch or fragment. Daniel analyzed urban electromagnetic fields and found them increasingly chaotic, unstable frequencies, clashing as artificial networks clattered against the rising natural resonance. Evelyn observed that the signal, while beneficial to intact ecosystems, acted like a disruptive force in environments dominated by synthetic structures cutting across the dissonance of skyscrapers' asphalt and steel, with no organic network to buffer or harmonize the influx. Human minds bore the full brunt of the resonance unmodulated raw. In New York, Paris, Tokyo, and Mumbai, emergency services recorded spikes in psychiatric admissions, sudden outbreaks of mass panic, flash mobs forming and dissolving without purpose, riots erupting without political cause, and in some rare cases, spontaneous gatherings of people singing or weeping together. Without knowing why, Samuel studied these patterns and concluded that urban minds fractured from nature were experiencing a resonance overload. The signal was trying to awaken memory, but there was no living bridge through which to soften its arrival. In its absence, the human psyche cracked and splintered, exposed to an ancient force too vast to process. He likened it to a radio receiving a signal far too powerful for its circuits, leading to feedback loops, short circuits, and emotional meltdowns. Jonathan noted that even the small patches of nature within cities, parks, rooftop gardens, urban forests, showed attempts to stabilize their surroundings. Trees formed dense interlocking canopies. Flowers bloomed in chaotic arrays, trying desperately to absorb and channel the signal to protect nearby humans. Yet the scars of concrete and iron ran deep. Daniel suggested that cities themselves might need to evolve to survive. That architecture and infrastructure designed around dead matter must give way to living structures capable of participating in resonance rather than resisting it. Evelyn watched footage of a park in Berlin where people had gathered spontaneously, lying in the grass, weeping, laughing, reaching out to touch the earth as if reuniting with a long-lost relative amid the chaos. Beauty sometimes emerged, moments of collective grief and wonder, signaling that even amidst the fracture, there was a path back, a bridge waiting to be rebuilt. The team debated the implications. Jonathan saw a hopeful opportunity, a chance to reweave human settlements into the living fabric of Earth. Daniel was more cautious, warning that attempts to force rapid change could trigger backlash and deeper instability. Samuel argued that humanity stood at a psychological crossroads: either learn to remember its place within the web of life, or succumb to madness and isolation. Evelyn saw both the danger and the hope. She proposed that their mission must expand beyond observation to preparation. They would need to develop ways to guide communities through the resonance, to provide templates of memory bridges to help human minds reconnect without shattering. They began drafting plans, experimental projects to seed urban ecosystems, with resonance hubs to train resonance facilitators who could help people navigate the shifts, to integrate natural living architecture into cityscapes as a way of grounding the rising tides of memory. Evelyn envisioned parks that sang with the earth's frequency, schools that taught not only knowledge, but remembrance, hospitals designed as gardens of healing. Daniel designed prototype resonance stabilizers, devices subtle and organic that could weave into existing infrastructure, harmonizing chaotic fields without suppressing the natural signal. Jonathan compiled ecological blueprints drawing from indigenous land management, ancient forest gardening, permaculture principles, weaving ancient wisdom with cutting-edge science. Samuel developed curricula for dreamwork, collective healing, and storytelling traditions that could reactivate the mythic memory needed to stabilize human identity within the larger living system. Yet, even as they planned, the world around them continued to convulse. Rural areas flourished, cities trembled, forests sang while highways cracked, seas pulsed, while skyscrapers flickered with ghost lights at night. The auroras expanded across latitudes where they had never been seen before. Great rivers glowed faintly under the stars. People awoke from fevered dreams, speaking in languages long dead or in harmonies without words. Evelyn felt the urgency building like a pressure. Behind her ribs, the signal was not waiting for permission. It was rising like an unstoppable tide flowing through soil water, stone, flesh, and mind. She knew that humanity stood at the threshold of a choice. Not of technology, not of politics, but of memory. The choice to return to the great symphony or to fall silent, lost amidst the ruins of a forgotten song. And she vowed that whatever it took, she and her companions would help as many as possible find their way back before it was too late, before the Earth's voice grew too strong for fragile human hearts to bear. As the days turned into weeks and the resonance deepened its grip upon the planet, Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Price, and Samuel Reed faced a sobering realization, one that settled into their bones heavier than any previous discovery. The signal was not requesting permission. It was not seeking negotiation or waiting for acknowledgement. It was moving with an inevitability as old and implacable as gravity itself. It was fusing with the Earth with or without human consent. Evelyn was the first to voice what they were all beginning to feel. During a rare moment of stillness in their work, she sat at the long conference table, her fingers tracing unconscious patterns on the worn wood. Her voice low, barely above a whisper. "This is not an invitation, it is a tide, and tides do not ask." Daniel nodded grimly. His data models had already shown that the resonance fields were accelerating independent of human action. Their efforts to stabilize urban zones, while noble, had proven to be mere sandbags against a rising ocean. The signal moved through electromagnetic channels, geological strata, biological networks, and consciousness itself, unfolding according to principles that cared nothing for human structures or opinions. Jonathan observed the unfolding changes in ecosystems and saw no malice in the signal, but no mercy either. It amplified what was ready to grow. It dismantled what could not adapt. Forests thrived, deserts shifted, rivers reawakened, but cities cracked at their foundations, and the brittle constructs of civilization groaned under the strain. Samuel saw it most clearly in the dreams and collective visions emerging across the globe. The Earth was not asking humanity to join. It was remembering itself, and in doing so, reshaping everything connected to it, including the fragile minds of the human species. The team debated the implications late into the nights, sometimes in tense arguments, sometimes in weary resignation. Evelyn clung to the belief that humanity could still choose to align, that through memory and resonance bridges could be built. But Daniel, less optimistic, pointed out that the choice was becoming less a true decision and more a matter of survival. Jonathan offered the view that adaptation had always been the way of life. Those who harmonized with changing conditions flourished. Those who resisted perished. Samuel warned that psychological fracture was already occurring and would only worsen for populations unable or unwilling to integrate. The emerging resonance, it was not a punishment but a consequence. The same way a wave does not punish a rock. It simply breaks it apart if the rock is too rigid. Evelyn found herself haunted by the thought that most of humanity was simply not prepared. Most had lived too long separated from the rhythms of the earth, cocooned in artificial systems that dulled the senses and atrophied the deep ancestral memory needed to recognize what was happening. She thought of the endless noise of cities, the walls of concrete and steel, the flickering false lights that blinded people to the stars overhead, the synthetic food, the synthetic air, the synthetic dreams. Daniel, working late nights, poring over chaotic field reports, observed how pockets of human communities that retained strong ties to nature, indigenous groups, permaculturists, off-grid villages seemed to absorb the signal with relative ease. Their mental health remained stable, even improved. Their creativity and resilience flourished. They dreamed vividly, sang new songs, grew stronger, while urbanized populations splintered and frayed. Jonathan mapped these patterns onto the ecological data and found a chilling mirror: ecosystems that maintained high biodiversity and minimal human interference adapted with fluid grace. Monocultures, industrial farms, deforested lands collapsed like brittle glass under a hammer. Samuel compiled dream records from thousands of individuals and saw a clear split: those who embraced the memories of connection, who let the ancient symbols and melodies flow through them, grew more coherent, more compassionate, more alive. Those who resisted, clinging to fragmented identities of separation, isolation, and dominance, suffered hallucinations, paranoia, emotional collapse. It was not a matter of belief. The resonance operated beneath belief, beneath thought itself, awakening primal architectures written into the very substrate of life itself. Evelyn likened it to a symphony beginning to swell across the earth. If a musician played along, even imperfectly, they were lifted by it. If they refused, the music simply played through them and the dissonance tore them apart. Daniel pushed the analogy further, suggesting that humanity was facing an evolutionary bottleneck, one not of genetics but of consciousness. The species would either remember how to sing with the earth, or it would be swept aside, forgotten, like so many lost branches of the great tree of life. Jonathan spoke of how ecosystems adapted not through struggle alone, but through cooperation and mutual flourishing. Those systems that resisted interconnection did not endure. They fossilized. Samuel, with a sorrow deeper than words, noted that mythology was full of warnings forgotten or ignored. Stories of civilizations that rose in arrogance, isolated themselves from the living world, and fell into ruin. Perhaps those were not mere fables, but memories, echoes of previous cycles of resonance now rising once again. Evelyn and her team knew then that the work ahead was no longer about persuasion. It was about preparation. They would not convince the world to accept the signal. They would help those who could adapt find ways to do so. They would build bridges for the willing and refugees for the awakening. They would bear witness for those too lost in noise and fear to hear the song until it was too late. Evelyn began drafting frameworks for resonance sanctuaries, places where people could relearn the forgotten art of living with Earth. Daniel designed adaptive systems that could buffer and translate the resonance for fragile minds, helping ease the transition rather than overwhelming. Jonathan expanded on his earlier ecological blueprints, envisioning entire biocentric communities grown around natural harmonics instead of mechanical efficiency. Samuel compiled a living mythology, gathering dreams, songs, visions into a new tapestry, a map not of conquest but of return. The team knew their efforts would not save everyone. They accepted that with heavy hearts. They moved with the calm urgency of those who understand. They are planting seeds for a forest they may never see fully grown outside their mountain refuge. The signs of transformation grew louder and clearer. Skyscrapers cracked as roots forced their way upward. Reclaiming stone and glass streets shifted as rivers remembered their ancient courses. Air once deadened by smog pulsed with subtle harmonies that unsettled and awoke in equal measure, and beneath it all, the earth itself sang a song that was not a demand, not a threat, not an offer, but a fact, a becoming. The signal was not coming to take the earth. It was the earth remembering itself, and in that remembering, humanity had only two choices: adapt and remember as well, or break and be forgotten. Evelyn Carter, Daniel Voss, Jonathan Price, and Samuel Reed stood together in the gathering twilight, knowing that the tide had turned, that the resonance would rise with or without them, and that their only task now was to hold open as many doors as they could, for as long as they could, trusting that some, at least, would find their way home before the last echoes of forgetting were swept away forever. The night was unlike any Evelyn Carter had ever seen. Standing alone atop the rocky outcrop, overlooking the valley, she felt the pulse of the world beneath her feet, a heartbeat slow and inexorable, carrying within it an ancient song that no words could capture overhead. The sky burned with colors that should not exist, streaks of violet gold, deep emerald, and unknown shades shimmering and folding into each other like living silk. The aurora danced not only at the poles but above forests, mountains, oceans, and cities, a crown of light for a world stirring from a long-forgotten dream. Daniel Voss, Jonathan Pryce, and Samuel Reed were scattered across the valley, each drawn to solitude by the immensity of what they were witnessing, each grappling in their own way with the magnitude of what had been set in motion. But it was Evelyn who stood highest, exposed and unshielded, letting the resonance flood through her without resistance. No instruments, no calculations, no theories, only the raw, unfiltered communion between herself and the awakening earth. She closed her eyes and listened, not with her ears but with the fibers of her being. The signal was no longer a whisper, no longer a faint tremor. It was a rising tide sweeping across continents, oceans, and hearts alike. It carried no anger, no demand, yet its presence was undeniable, unstoppable, relentless. It was the voice of memory, the breath of life reclaiming its rightful place. Evelyn thought of the greenhouse where cooperation had blossomed in weeks instead of centuries. She thought of the reborn forests, the rivers that had cut new paths, the coral that had remembered how to sing. She thought, too, of the cities splintering under the weight of forgotten truths, the chaos, the beauty, the fear, the awe, and now standing under a sky that seemed to breathe and hum with living light. She understood more deeply than she ever had before. The earth was not asking, it was becoming, whether humanity listened or not. The song would go on. Daniel was somewhere below, tracking the shifts in electromagnetic fields, a scientist to the last. But Evelyn knew that even he, with all his algorithms and data models, felt the truth in his bones. The models were obsolete. Now the equations could not contain the magnitude of transformation. Jonathan roamed the edges of the wild places, gathering the first seeds of the new forests, the beginnings of new gardens woven not by human hands, but by the will of the living earth. He too knew that what was unfolding could not be managed, could not be directed, only witnessed and perhaps joined. Samuel sat in silence among ancient stones, dream-walking through the currents of collective human consciousness, feeling the fracture lines, the places where memory strained to break through the walls of fear, and forgetting he bore the sorrow of those who would not awaken and the fragile hope of those who might. Evelyn opened her eyes and saw the land around her, bathed in ethereal glow, trees reaching upward, leaves trembling in rhythms too complex for the mind to grasp, streams murmuring songs woven from gravity and starlight. Even the stones seemed lighter, as if remembering they were once born of the same fire as the stars above. And she realized the earth was waiting. It had called out not in command, but in invitation. It had stirred not to punish, but to awaken. Yet it would not wait forever. The choice lay with humanity, to step forward into remembrance or to wither clinging to the brittle shells of old dreams. Evelyn felt the burden of that choice heavy in her chest. She saw the billions living in cities whose skies no longer showed the stars, whose waters no longer sang, whose hearts beat to the frantic pulse of machines, rather than the slow tides of earth. She thought of the children dreaming dreams seeded by concrete and neon, and she wondered if they would hear the song, if anyone would remember how to listen. But she also thought of the small communities, the forgotten places, the stubborn gardens, the songs sung quietly into the night by those who never fully forgot, who still carried in their blood the rhythm of rain and root and river, and she knew that all was not lost. Not yet. The signal grew stronger still. Evelyn felt it rising within her, not as a force pressing from without, but as something waking inside. Her own cells, her own memory. She remembered not with her mind, but with her body, the way trees spoke in wind, the way rivers dreamed their paths, the way mountains hummed in stone silence. She remembered the feeling of belonging to a world that was not dead matter but living mind, and she wept not from sadness, but from the fierce, overwhelming beauty of it all. The aurora above brightened, swirling into a great spiral that seemed to reach down to the earth, and Evelyn understood that the door was opening, not a door built by human hands, but a door of resonance and memory, a door into a future where humanity could once again be part of the great song, not as masters, not as conquerors, but as kin. And yet she knew too that if humanity chose fear, if it chose to cling to its illusions of separation, if it chose to harden against the rising tide, it would simply be left behind. Not with cruelty, not with judgment, but with the indifference of a river flowing around a stone. She thought of Daniel of old, Jonathan of Samuel of all the others, who even now were working to keep the door open a little longer, to light small beacons in the gathering dusk. She thought of the children yet to be born, who might inherit a world once more alive and singing. She thought of the earth herself, vast and patient and sorrowful and fierce, and she whispered into the shimmering night a vow without words that she would not turn away. Not now, not ever. Far below her the valleys stirred forests, murmured oceans, heaved winds, carried whispers in tongues older than speech. The earth waited not with anger, not with threat, but with the implacable stillness of a mother watching to see if her children would remember their names. Evelyn stood beneath the impossible sky, her arms open, her heart bared, feeling the resonance rise within her, until she could no longer tell where she ended and the world began. And in that moment, she understood that the future was unwritten, not guaranteed, not promised, but possible if humanity could listen, if it could remember, if it could choose to awaken and step through the door that was opening before them. And if it could not, the earth would still sing, would still dream, would still dance in light and gravity and time. The story would go on with or without them. And so the first chapter closed not with an ending, but with a beginning, an opening, a breath held in the vast lungs of the world, as Evelyn Carter stood beneath the trembling heavens, feeling the pulse of a living earth and waiting, with all creation, to see what humanity would choose.